Thank you.
To tell them what the name of your talk is. Can you?
I forgot myself. I think it's about the coming Cold War between the U.S. and China. I think we should all fasten our seatbelts, something to that effect. Anyway, I want to thank Peg for this really very generous introduction. I will be on the East Coast for 8 months next year. My 2 boys are there in the DC area, so that's an extra bonus. I lived in the DC area for 10.5 years, and I really like the place, and it's a great time. It's a really great opportunity for me professionally, but more importantly, I think at this critical juncture between the US and China, the more expertise you can have, the better, I hope, I think we will be in terms of thinking about policies that will prevent conflict and promote American interests. So what you have seen and heard just now from this large screen is probably the most middle of the road, moderate take on China. And this is not happening inside the government. This kind of view does not have much influence inside the government. Today, inside the US government, the dominant view is one of hawkishness about China. So just want to give you a perspective so that you can see how far and how fast US policy has moved. I would say in the last 6 months. But the developments that led to the move of this policy have been in the works for years. So it's not something that happened overnight. I think technically speaking, the adjustment policy happened very, very quickly, but the forces that were building up for this change were there for a long, long time. So I'll give you how long do I have, Pat?
Until you want to quit.
Oh, no. I think I'll leave you more time for Q&A because I think that hearing from you is much more important than just pontificating away about how I think about this issue. I've been really thinking a lot about this issue. It's not an exaggeration to say that this is the defining moment of the 21st century. If the analysts are right, and if the world's two greatest powers are headed toward long-term geopolitical conflict, everything changes. Okay, so that's something I want to leave it to you to think about. I mean, we hope it's not the case, but the day after day, more developments happen. It seems that we are indeed headed down that path, and that's very tragic. Maybe it's unavoidable. It's like a Greek tragedy that's being played out. But when you think about it, that at least, well, in China, it's a one-party dictatorship, so policy is made by a handful of people. Most people just don't get to say anything. But even in this democracy, the way that the change of the China policy happened really did not have much public input. Most Americans don't even know that Washington and Beijing are now headed toward geopolitical conflict. Even though I would say there's a lot of support in the elite circle in the US for this change. So this is just give you some background. So now why do I say that the US-China are most likely headed toward another Cold War? Repeat, the Cold War will be very different this time. Now, if we have time, we'll talk about this. So first I will explain give you some background. And second, I would discuss what's going on, why we are so alarmed about what's going on. And third, we speculate about the consequences. If this is indeed the future, then what will the future look like? So first one is why a 4-decade policy has collapsed. Because since Nixon's visit, 4 decades and a half, I would say, since Nixon's visit, 1972, the U.S. has consistently maintained a bipartisan support, bipartisan policy of engaging China. The goal was to, and you have to live, and in the room there were quite a few of us who were still around in 1972. You have to think about this policy in the context of the world in 1972. China was miserably poor, isolated, 1 billion people. The U.S. was faced with a geopolitical adversary that possessed the capacity to destroy the U.S. physically. So think about the geopolitical rationale for engaging China, and also think about what I call the humanitarian passion behind this policy. Because China, the Chinese people, 1 billion people, were suffering under a brutal dictatorship, isolated, living in grinding poverty. And it was really the combination of geopolitical interest, and you might call this Christian, humanitarian passion that, and of course, there's always this American political missionary spirit of trying to turn every country it sees into a democracy, right? So this combination that brought together very powerful forces in American society to engage China. Engage means to help China open its doors, to promote China's integration into the world, to do whatever America can to help China develop economically. And this is a policy that has been being supported, implemented by various administrations until the Trump administration. The cracks in this policy began to emerge long before the Trump administration came along. But by and large, historians would date this period, the engagement period, from 1972 to 2018 or 2017. Secretary Rice talked about the Pence speech. I hope if you have a chance to take a look, read it. It's treated now by, again, instant analysts such as me as the official declaration of Cold War, because it is a very devastating speech. Nobody has ever given such a speech on China, nobody in high places. It ought to be a speech given by Donald Trump, but we all know that probably he does not have the attention span to go through a 40-minute speech on teleprompt. So it was left to Mike Pence to deliver this very important speech. So this is the background about engagement policy. So the engagement policy had a set of assumptions and rationales and objectives. Let me summarize them very briefly. In terms of humanitarian objective, that is really to improve the livelihoods of the world's largest society population, right? So that objective has been accomplished. Economic objective is that China will be integrated into global economy and be a player in the global economy that nevertheless obeys the rules of the global trading system. And in terms of security, the U.S. expected China, assumes that because China derives so much in terms of economic benefits from its integration with the American-dominated system, China will have this strong incentive to play second fiddle to or to obey the rules of geopolitics set by the U.S. So in other words, China, however powerful China becomes economically, China will not overtly or aggressively challenge America's security interests. Concretely, China will not develop a very powerful military. China will not try to do things in America's traditional spheres of influence, such as Latin America. China will not try to organize a separate international system that competes with the American system. So this is the geopolitical objective. And then because the U.S. Genuinely believes in the ideals of democracy and human rights, American policymakers believe that China's economic development will ultimately lead to political transformation. That instead of being a one-party dictatorship, China will become more like us in terms of its political institutions. So these were the powerful assumptions or rationale for supporting engagement policy with China. But around, I would say, 10 years ago, questions began to emerge and ask, are we kidding ourselves? Let's do a reality check. Is China developing, moving in a way that meets those expectations, that fulfills those assumptions? This exercise was carried out under the Obama administration. But no policy, well, I would say there was a policy to confront China, but it was done very diplomatically, very covertly, and very subtly. If you recall, 2010, the U.S. announced this policy of pivot to Asia. Just typing pivot to Asia, and as you will see, because by that time, the U.S. already concluded that China needs a big pushback to know that it is on the wrong path. So the pivot to Asia had three components. One was diplomatic, that the U.S. would deepen its political, geopolitical, or diplomatic engagements with China's neighbors. Top U.S. leaders will show up just to underscore America's interest and commitment to the region. Very important. Which actor, famous American said, 90% or 95% of the business is just showing up, right? So just show up. The second leg is military, because U.S.-China strategic rivalry will happen mostly on high seas, in oceans. Very different from the Soviet-U.S. rivalry, which was basically land-based warfare. That is, the Russians would go across Central Europe and invade Western Europe. But in terms of U.S.-China potential military rivalry or conflict, it's made really a naval conflict. So the U.S. announced that it will move 60% of its naval assets, big ships, away from everywhere else to Western Pacific. It actually tells China, that gesture was designed to deter China. It said, don't think about confronting, challenging the U.S. militarily. And the third leg is economic. And that's something called TPP, trade. Because China is now Asia's biggest economy. And China is every Asian country's biggest trading partner. So over time, China would be like this magnet that would suck all the commercial activities from its neighbors, and it will become the hub. And the U.S. cannot allow that to happen. So in order to prevent that from happening, the U.S. came up with this idea called Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. Guess what was this pop quiz, right? what was the first act Trump performed upon getting into the White House? It went down the drain. So TPP was not there. So this was, I'm just giving some historical perspective to say that the shift of policy happened a long time ago, but it was a very different shift, much less overtly confrontational, but in terms of substance, it's every bit as firm as a policy designed to deter China from being aggressive and designed to protect America's interests. And I thought it was a very well designed policy, had all the ducks lined up, saw through, so that was the policy. So that was how Obama dealt with China's rise. So Pence's speech technically was not true, because now the administration is saying that the previous administrations had done nothing about China. That's not true. Previous administrations has taken various measures to deal with the consequences of China's rise. But things changed very rapidly after Trump's entry into the White House. He surrounded himself with people who are genuinely, what shall I say, indifferent to the idea of alliances, that you actually need partners if you want to do something. America's first means America alone, really. They think the U.S. is powerful enough. So they do not do the sort of TPP and others. And also they were trade protectionists who viewed trade as a zero-sum game. So trade becomes a very easy target. So that's the sort of why it changed. Is that this administration acts really quite impulsively. I'm not saying that necessarily incorrectly. It can, if you do something very quickly, sometimes by sheer luck you can actually do something correct. So this is the. So this is the background, but the conclusion is that the underlying strategic reasons for engaging China became very weak and probably disappeared completely in the last 5 or 7 years. This is China's behavior. And within China, instead of being a democracy, China today is much more repressive than it used to be. So that, again, disappointed a lot of people. Economically, many American businesses saw that China could become a great market. Well, China has become a big market, except not for American businesses. So they became very disappointed because China's economy is not exactly American-style free capitalist economy. It's heavily dominated by the government, a lot of restrictions on investments, business activities in China. So it's not really a level playing field. And because the Chinese Communist Party depends on state-owned enterprises to control the economy, it keeps subsidizing state-owned enterprises that can distort the economy as well. So lots of very legitimate complaints about Chinese economic behavior. And but one thing that really got Washington's attention was the rapid shift in China's power. Not only because the way we think China will turn out to be disappointed us, right? But because the balance of power between the U.S. and China shifted beyond belief. 1972, China was dreadfully poor. I don't even know the percentage of the share of the Chinese economy as share of the U.S. GDP, probably around 4%. Really a tiny bit. 1980, still 6% of Chinese economy measured in dollar terms was 6% of U.S. economy, because dollar is if you want to measure a country's power, use dollar. Don't use something called purchasing power parity. You cannot use purchasing power parity to buy anything on the international market. Okay, so you have to use dollar. So 1980, China's economy was 6%. 1990, Chinese economy was 6%. Okay. 2000, 12%. Now the biggest change was between 2000 and 2010, and this is after China got into WTO. Chinese economy was 40% within 10 years, and then today it's about 64% of the U.S. economy. So just all of a sudden, I think the rapid growth of the Chinese economy, and then don't forget about the relative slow growth of the U.S. economy in the last 10 years, the Great Recession, greatly shook American self-confidence, because engagement was premised on the assumption that the U.S. will always maintain overwhelming superiority vis-a-vis China. But in the last decade, that overwhelming superiority was no longer there. China is not at parity, but at the current trajectory, China will be at parity with the U.S. in about 10 years. So so the overwhelming consensus in the security establishment was that we have to act before it is too late. This is our last chance to prevent a peer competitor from emerging. So this is the power dimension, not just about the strategic dimension. I think what happened in the last 5 years is especially pertinent and important in terms of understanding why the shift happened so quickly. Because China had a new leader. Before this new leader, Xi Jinping, came along, China was already very big in terms of its economic size, but Chinese policy was relatively restrained. China's previous leaders were very cautious. They knew that they needed really good relations with the U.S. in order to maintain their advantages, economic advantages in particular. So while they were growing, they did not undertake actions that would be seen overtly threatening to the U.S. But this changed completely in the last 5 years. The new leader in Beijing, besides being much more hardline politically than his predecessors, on the international stage, he became very expansionist, very aggressive, and almost completely indifferent to American concerns. And he did, I would say, two things that fundamentally changed Washington's perception of China. One was his idea, commercially crazy, okay, but crazy ideas become policy all the time, of financing, using Chinese money, financing infrastructure around the world. He said it will be a $1 trillion investment. China will help build roads, ports, railways, power plants. He called Belt and Road Project. Washington and people in the West began to wonder why is this guy doing this? Is he trying to reroute the global commerce? Is he trying to implement a new form of colonialism? In other words, he's trying to change the world. And if you want to change the world to your neighbors, at least, well, if you want to reroute traffic in your neighborhood, don't you think your neighbors would at least have some concerns? He did not think about the geopolitical consequences of that scheme. So the U.S. became quite opposed to this idea. The other idea, he said, was, the other thing he did was the South China Sea. I'm sure you're aware of those massive artificial islands. This is a disputed area. And the sensible thing to do is to leave it alone. Just do not, because if you want to put down an illegal structure in this middle of this is a no man's land, don't you think the cop will get involved, right? And the cop in this case is the U.S. The U.S. was, because the U.S. was watching China very carefully. The U.S. had several yardsticks, measurements, to see whether China is threatening American core interests. And this is really a red line, because if you put down 5 big islands in one of the most important strategic areas in the world, and you get away with it, what would your neighbors think about U.S. resolve, U.S. commitment? Because the Americans would be viewed as laughingstocks, right? As a bunch of, what shall I say, as a country that does not really care about China's dominance in that part of the world. So the U.S. decided to lay down a red line. Of course, Obama, I think that there was not enough time left in his administration to develop a comprehensive approach to push back. But that, I would say, if I have to pinpoint one incident, one act China has done that contributed to the collapse of the engagement policy, that was it. Of course, economically, you heard about this of China, Made in China 2025. This is an industrial policy designed to use state funding to develop technologies that would directly compete with American high tech. There's something in international economy called division of labor. So if you are pretty good at doing certain things, just the law of economics tells you that you're probably not very good at doing other things. It's better you stick with those things. But if you announce a very ambitious plan and try to use government funding to do it, you're likely to upset other people, because you not only distort the market, essentially you are telling your best customer, in this case the U.S., because the U.S. is China's best customer, is that we're going to eat your lunch at some point. So don't you think your best customer would like to eat his lunch? So all of these policies in the last 5 years greatly accelerated the change of American policy. So if I have to sort of put the blame on any party, I'll put 90% of the blames on China. I think China had it coming. I'm not saying that the way China is being handled is the right way, but I think Chinese leaders, Chinese policies bear most of the responsibility for the downturn. So this is very clear. So what is happening today? I think what is happening today, initially I think it was not very coherent. Now we see, at least on the economic front, some coherent strategy of pushing back against China. We have not seen the strategic piece yet, the security piece. We don't know the diplomatic piece. But what is happening, sooner or later they will fall in place. They will emerge. I think the biggest problem the U.S. has is we don't have top-level leadership. All these policies are not being pushed by Trump. They're being pushed by other people. He's essentially outsourced China policy to second-tier people. He's focused only one thing: trade deficits. His advisors are much smarter than he is. His advisors are focusing on something called supply chain. We'll talk about this later on. So the policy, the economic policy, the thrust is economic decoupling. Think about the economic decoupling, because U.S. and China are closely connected economically over the past 40 years. Just one simple test: go to Walmart, Home Depot, and try to buy something that's not made in China, right? So the first order of business is to end this, is to put an end to relying on China as a source of manufactured goods. And it's in the minds of the people who are implementing this policy, who have designed this policy. It's simple. All you need to do is to put 25% tariff. Then the cost of buying things made in China will be much higher than the cost of buying things in India, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Mexico. So this is the first. The term being used is called disintermediation. That is because when you trade, you have some middleman. China actually is the middleman in terms of making stuff. China makes stuff. China performs mostly assembly functions, because if you look at iPhone, right, everybody's favorite gadget, an example, iPhone designed in the Silicon Valley, all the components are made around in the US, some Europe, and mostly in East Asia. They're all flown, trucked to China, and where it's stitched together. The value added in China is about 5% of a cell phone, of a phone. But China is the middle of it. This global supply chain. So if you use government policy and you're going to wipe out China's competitive advantage. So this is the real strategy. So if the policy is successful, probably in the next 5 to 7 years, it would take a long time for factories to be built, infrastructure to be built, to reroute the global supply chain. I think U.S. China trade probably will be cut by 70-80%. We're talking about a huge cut. This is $640 billion trade bilateral, so it was just huge consequences. So this is, and then another piece is that disintermediation is that if you look at the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement, there's a clause called, I think, 30-10 section, which says none of the signing parties can reach a free trade agreement with a non-market economy, read China, without the consent of other signing parties, which means that Mexico or Canada cannot reach free trade agreement with China. This is now being talked about as the template for signing free trade agreement with other countries. So if the U.S. uses this template to sign a free trade agreement with Japan, potentially it can get back into TPP or Europe. Then those countries cannot sign free trade agreement. So we're not talking about really economic isolation, a strategy of economic isolation. Well, so far we have not seen the military piece yet, but it will be there, and the diplomatic piece. But the trend is very, very worrisome. Let me just end with one observation. I think what will be the consequences? I just single out two. One, obviously economic. I think the costs of manufactured goods around the world will go up, because China is really very efficient in producing low middle end. If you go elsewhere, the supply chain will be more fragmented, because just no single country has the size, the density, the infrastructure to support this supply base. Vietnam is big, 100 million, but that's only 1/10. So global economic growth will slow down. Costs of things we buy will go up here. Jobs are not going to come back, because this is just even with because if you make things, you would make them elsewhere. Just can't, because the supply chain will be moving around in East and Southeast Asia, but not coming back. Another, I think, potential consequence is what I call the emergence of two economic blocs. You have a China bloc. China is about 12 trillion. The U.S. is about 20 trillion. So a lot of countries will have to trade with China. So you'll have two. It's not like the Soviet Union, the military bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and NATO. It will be a China economic bloc and a U.S. economic bloc. So that, again, economically, it's very inefficient. My biggest worry is something that was mentioned in the talk today, global climate change. The world only has about 10, 12 years to get its act together before catastrophe becomes unavoidable. China emits 10 out of 40 billion tons of CO2. The US emits about 5 billion a year. So the two countries, 15 billion. And if the two countries are strategic adversaries whose overriding interest is to see the other guy suffer, see the other guy lose advantage, how can they work together to address this existential threat to humanity? So this is the most frightening thing if you think about all kinds of clean energy, all kinds of international agreements, pressure to get all nations together to act against global climate change. And you have the world's number one, number two economies, number one, number two polluters engaged in a geopolitical contest of will. God help us. Sorry to end on such a downbeat note, but this is indeed a very, very sad moment in history. Okay. Thank you. I have about 20 minutes. Yes.
I'll admit to a very unimpressive understanding of what has been happening in the South China Sea. And I'm wondering if you could give us some clarification of what China's motivation has been in this region.
Okay.
What they call an imbroglio.
Yeah, well, first let me clarify. This region, technically speaking, nobody owns anything. This is like the equivalent of desert, right? But what if the biggest guy on the block goes up, puts up a house there, and says it's mine? So China has several strategic and economic incentives. One is that region is very rich in fish, protein, right? So you want to dominate the area because all know about the sort of 200-mile exclusive economic zone, EEZ. So if you have an island and you claim it's yours, 200 miles out, and nobody can fish there. So that's one. Second is that region probably has a lot of hydrocarbon, natural gas, oil. So if you get in there, nobody can exploit the oil. So this is economic. But most importantly is strategic. The U.S. Is this guarantor of peace and stability and balance of power in Asia Pacific. The U.S. strategic interest in Asia is that no single country should dominate the region. We're talking about the U.S. being U.S. power, right? You want to be really the world number one. But China wants to test that resolve. China wants to show its neighbors, you cannot count on the U.S. It's so far away. We are the big guy on the block. And we want to do something to show you that the Americans are powerless to challenge us. Building an artificial island does not violate existing international law. It's not illegal. It's not unlawful. It's simply not allowed. But it doesn't. It's a gray area. So in terms of tactics, it's really very brilliant tactic. But it backfired big time in terms of strategy because the U.S. says, no way. We're not going to be intimidated. We're not going to be shown to be impotent. We're going to push back. We're going to show to everybody in the region that we mean what we say. So that's why it's so important. Yes?
paths in diplomacy with China?
Well, if Trump wins, the current course will continue. If a Democrat wins, I think hardline policy will continue, but will be sugar-coated. It will be much more multilateral. It will be couched, the policy will be justified by alliances, by international rule. What is happening in the trade front effectively has destroyed the World Trade Organization. So the U.S. may win the trade war. I don't think the U.S., well, in the sense that China will lose more than the U.S. too. But at the end of the day, another casualty is something that is called international law, international norms. So that's so I think the Democrats will be a lot less reckless. Trump is just a wrecking ball. He just goes everywhere and wrecks everything, right? Okay. Yeah, India is interesting. India, this is just golden opportunity for two countries, India and Vietnam. They're going to benefit. India's position is like China's position in the 1980s, 1970s. China is in position of the former Soviet Union. And Vietnam is smaller. But so economically and strategically, these two countries are going to be huge beneficiaries of American adjustment. Yes?
Is there in China some people concerned about some environmental concern that has something like in the United States, a lot of people are worried about the environment. Is that true in China?
Oh yes, except China is a one-party state. There's no freedom of press, no free association. Concerns cannot be easily mobilized into politics. Well, you go to China, you can't breathe there, you cannot see. Things are getting better, I heard, but still pretty bad. I think in this country, at least there are courts. You can go to sue, right? Elections, you can put some, you can vote for people who will be championing environmental causes. Yeah. Yes, the one over there.
What role will nuclear weapons play?
Yeah, I think nuclear weapons will not play a very important role, unlike the other Cold War. When you think about great power competition, where like generals who fight the last war, right? I think much more dangerous will be cyber. Yes. Why would you use nuclear weapons when you can trace, right? The other guy has it too, and you lob at each other, and you something called MAD, mutually assured destruction, right? So you don't do MAD. Cyber is much more, and then just think about other just new technologies that emerging, drones, AI. But I hope both countries learn the lessons of the last Cold War. Part of my research at the Library of Congress is to look at lessons we learned from the Cold War, how to avoid repeating the same mistakes. It's not pleasant. Okay? I'm sure people like Steve Bannon, who's been championing this Cold War for ages, will feel personal satisfaction. I think most Americans should feel sadness about engaging in a really sort of a geopolitical, military, long-term conflict with a country of 1.4 billion people. Just as a Chinese American, I feel very, very sad about this. Yeah. Yes.
Within higher education, China is a significant, if not the most significant sender of international
Yes.
students
Yes.
abroad. What do you think, could be the future of international education within the United States specifically?
Okay, I think there are two forces that will work against the exchange of Chinese students, the coming of Chinese students to the U.S. One is purely economic. If the trade war plays out, China's economic growth will fall. China's foreign exchange reserves, foreign exchange earnings will fall. So China will actually have much less money ordinary Chinese middle class to finance. And then as the U.S. becomes much less friendly toward China, the relationship, Chinese parents will not send their kids to the U.S. They will send them to, even if they have the money, to Canada, Australia, UK, Europe, right? So this is the sort of economic and social. Then politically, I think the U.S. There's already this talk in the White House about restricting Chinese students. I think a comprehensive restriction is unlikely because it will be devastating to American higher education. If you go to states, about most graduate programs in science and sciences, engineering cannot function without Chinese grad students. And a lot of smaller colleges, second-tier schools, private, will close without Chinese undergrads. So it will be just huge. It's, but still, you know, you can never tell how crazy somebody like Stephen Miller can be, right? if you know who he is. Yeah. Stephen Miller, the most hardline anti-immigration policymaker in the White House. He's actually proposed to cut off every, to ban completely Chinese students from coming. Yes?
What would be a way for the U.S. to challenge Chinese expansionism that would be respected by the Chinese administration?
Well, I think the Chinese administration will never expect, will never respect. It will be upset with anything the U.S. does. I think.
Let's put this in a quiet.
Yeah.
Something that would be done quietly, but would be in a language that I think the Xi Jinping's administration would understand. They have probably gone far enough, and now it's time to moderate.
Yeah, I would say actually now is a good time because the U.S. means business, right? You see this giant locomotive coming down, crushing you. Do you want it to crush you, or do you want it to stop? So, because you have to have credibility. I think previous administrations probably soft-pedaled, even though they pushed back, did not push hard enough. Now you pushed hard enough. So this is all. But I would say another thing. We need a combination of very forceful response done or carried out in complete cooperation with allies. This is cool. This is crucial because you're not if you don't do this with the support of your allies, you're going to be the costs are much higher, and the results probably are not as good. One more question. Yes.
I would presume that the students from China who have returned are mostly friendly. They've had a good time in the United States. They appreciate their experience here, and they're like ambassadors to the United States there. If none of them come anymore, relations between the two countries will increase, right?
Yeah. Well, by and large, I agree, but also there were mixed pictures. Some Chinese students are very nationalistic. They come here, they feel more Chinese, more patriotic. They go back, they can become ultra-nationalists. But the majority who come here have a much deeper understanding of what the U.S. is about and have enormous respect for America's values, for the openness, and really the friendliness of American people. That's why I'm one of them, right? I was a student more than 30 years ago, and they wanted to promote, because when they go back to China, their so-called frame of reference is the U.S. They will always use U.S. as the model, as a marker of aspiration. And that's a great thing. Why should we end this? That's why I'm just very, very strongly opposed to a blanket ban Chinese students. I think it's racist, just to put it bluntly, especially coming from Stephen Miller. and I think it's self-destructive, and it just serves nobody's purpose. So that's why I think if you want to tightly control certain very sensitive areas, you can do it because it involves a lot of administrative bureaucratic hassle. Okay, thank you so much. I did not expect it. I expect great exchange, which did take place.
Okay, now these are California things because I don't want you to forget California. while you're back.
No, I'm not gonna. Yeah, I'm coming back. My home is here, and this is really California.
Okay, see, I forced it out of him, didn't I?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, and we
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed it. I learned a lot myself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.